All right, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It is time to start. Pulpit clock says 7:17, so 2-minute grace period. All right, we're looking at Esther 8, 1 through 2 tonight. So if you turn there in your notes, we're on page 113. We only have a couple more chapters. There's 10 chapters in Esther. The 10th chapter is kind of a misnomer. There's only 3 verses. So there's really, you would say 9, a little bit of 1. It's not even half of 1. So I have some ideas about where we're going to go next. I'm not going to say that right now. I don't want to get locked into anything, but more than likely it will be in the Old Testament still. I'm a big fan of, if we can, going into at least the same genre or the same time period, progressive, like say Jonah and Nahum, and then so this here, if you remember Judges, and we did a study with Ruth. That's all at the same time, or closely related there. Possibly we'll be going into Nehemiah and Ezra as well. In the Jewish delineation of the books of the Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah are actually considered more or less one book, but it does deal with the Persian Empire, and kind of a different angle, a very different angle, because now with those books, that deals with the restoration of the Jews in the land, building up the walls, that kind of thing. So resettling the land, which is really cool. First of all, it's a fulfillment of prophecy, but you see in certain cases, they're not in great spiritual shape, but this was a time where they regained some spiritual momentum, so it's pretty cool. But it's all during the Persian Empire too, so more or less the same time period. But I'll let you know. We'll be there soon enough. Anyway, Esther 1 through 2. Before we begin, let's make sure that we prepare ourselves mentally and also get in fellowship here. Paul says in Ephesians 5:15 through 16, it says, "But examine everything carefully. Hold fast to that which is good. Abstain from every form of evil." So examining everything carefully, this is a theme I think that many people need to really think about, and how they live their life. Just, when you consider the sheer madness around us today in these last days, and all these various, we've been talking about conspiracies and so forth, competing philosophies and viewpoints. We need to examine everything carefully, and examine everything carefully through the lens of divine viewpoint, Bible doctrine. This is how we should evaluate things. This is called biblical discernment. You have to use God's standards. And so here, this examine here is just to look at, and then carefully. This is an adverb, and basically it means a strict conformity to a standard. So the standard, when you're examining something, the standard is, again, God's divine viewpoint. And then, of course, hold fast to that which is good. Good in terms of Bible doctrine. Abstain from every form of evil, whether it's in your thinking, whether it's participating in types of evil activity, that kind of thing as well. So we are to be very careful as well in these last days, where we see the evil around us, but we're not to be sucked into that and influenced by that. And that's been a problem with a lot of believers. We know with the Laodicean era, believers really are not careful. And so because of that, they get sucked into these various conspiracies. They get drawn into different forms of evil as well. And then just simply, they fall away from the faith. That's another main characteristic of the last days too. Many believers just fall away. No longer interested in God's plan, His word or His plan. And that's a big problem. Anyway, you're here, so you're not part of that. And you should be thankful, and I would encourage you to keep your momentum, your spiritual momentum. Do not let anything get in the way of your spiritual momentum. As a matter of fact, for all the exhortations not to be selfish and focus on self, there is one thing that you need to be selfish with and focus on self, and that is your spiritual walk, because you're doing it for God. You have to make time for that, and you have to make the commitment. And if you're not, then you need to reevaluate where you are, and then, of course, make the right corrections. So with this in mind, let's make sure that we are in fellowship here, prepared to concentrate, because the ordeal in Esther is not over yet. It's kind of a lull in the action, we'll see. And then, of course, you have the bigger problem of the genocide. That is still in effect. So even though Haman's dead, there's still issues, residual issues here, to say the least. So anyway, before we begin, rebound if you need to, and I'll begin with a word of prayer. Let us pray. Father, thank you for this opportunity that we can study the book of Esther. I pray that you'd give us wisdom in these matters, help us to apply these to our lives, and bless this class to our further spiritual advancement in Christ's name I pray. Amen. All right, before we go on to Esther here, we were looking at, I just want to revisit something here, conspiracies. We looked at part of the demonic influence in the last days. Not just the last days, there have been conspiracies. You know, as long as Satan's been around, basically, there's been different kinds of conspiracies and so forth. Modern conspiracies, so-called modern conspiracies, UFO related, that's old news, really. You know, you can see these waves of conspiracies sweeping the public through various generations and so forth. UFO is not so much in the news as much. Flat Earth is, though, and the fact that some people deny there are any moon landings. And, you know, this is, again, against observable fact. And then also the Illuminati, as I mentioned, that there's groups of individuals, super rich and others that actually are the powers behind government powers, that kind of thing. There has been some proof to that, of course. There's secret societies and actually some societies, not so secret. They just brazenly tell you what they're about. And it's about control. And there's definitely, you know, when you look at the satanic, definitely satanic influence. And then the QAnon, this is a deep state. Supposedly, this has gained more press lately about how Donald Trump is fighting a pedophilic satanic cult. They are engaged in the sex trade of children, supposedly, and somehow opposed to overthrowing Donald Trump. And there's a lot of believers in this. This is hysterical, to say the least. And not saying that there aren't conspiracies, deep state conspiracies, there are. But this is something that's just outrageous. But it doesn't matter anymore. That is the thing of the last days. If something is completely outrageous, then it'll fly. It'll be, people will believe, it'll gain traction and so forth. And that is one of the things that, you know, it's offered against all proof. No one's really been able to specify who in fact started this or anything like that, nor have they been able to substantiate any of this. That is an issue, yet people believe this. So go figure, right? It's the same mindset. And one thing after or during class or after class on Sunday, I totally forgot about this conspiracy. I can't believe I did that, but Holocaust denial. This is something in the last few years, I'll say in the last 15 to 20, that people are starting to say, nope, didn't happen. It's all a Jewish conspiracy. And this is a really good example that that will show you that you could actually, if you were able to, okay, buy a ticket. This is if you're allowed in Europe right now, but we have COVID. But anyway, all things being equal, you buy a ticket, you can go over to Europe, and you can actually walk the grounds of Auschwitz, okay, one of the notorious concentration camps, and others. That's one. Bergen-Belsen, there's others all around in various states of disrepair. But, you know, they have, I forget the slogan in German, but at work makes you free or whatever. I mean, it's all right there where you can actually touch the crematoriums. You can walk the grounds where millions of Jews walked and actually where millions of Jews died. You can go there and physically walk around. And yet you have people that, and that's just one thing. You have people that say, no, it didn't happen. This is all a Jewish conspiracy because you know why? The Jews want to control everything and history. And I mean, this defies reason. But it is, if nothing else, instructive to show you that some people are absolutely irrational with this type of stuff, you know, and there's other things. I mean, people will flat out deny it. And when you see this, I don't know if you're around people that have actually voiced this, it's absolute ignorance and to me, okay, this is something that smacks of, they're absolutely anti-Semitic. And if I were you, as a positive believer, you do not want to be around people that are anti-Semitic, okay? You do not want to be around Haman types, all right? Because it won't go well. You will be, if you cultivate relationships with this type, this is guaranteed cursing by association. So, and this is not to say the Jews have it together. No, they're apostate, but they remain God's chosen people. This is one of the things that you will see throughout history. And if people can't see that, then they're actually blind in regarding history. So people just flat out deny Holocaust. It never happened. Even though you can actually, there's proof. And then also there was I believe it was on Netflix, kind of interesting. I started at one time. It was a movie about, or a documentary about survivors of the prison camps, of the concentration camps. That's another thing too. If it's a Jewish conspiracy, and by the way, more than Jews were gassed and so forth, there was more than that, others as well, but you have all these individuals walking the planet even now, not so many anymore, but they have tattoos on their arm with a number. Why do they have all these strength? Why a number? Well, that was their number in the death camps. And so one of the things, another thing too, for the Holocaust deniers, just to show you the absolute irrational nature of this, the Nazis were very meticulous in keeping records. They have records of their final solution. They have in their own statements, we did this. Okay, and X number of Jews were executed, or they have the whole plan. It's all been revealed. You have people, though, that will say it never happened. So you have people that do not actually view reality normally in this sense. So when this prevails, this is not any surprising that you have a grand delusion of things, that you do believe in the flat earth, all these various things. Another thing, too, by the way, while we're on a historical note, Stalin killed about just as many, if not more. Do you ever hear people saying, nope, no, he didn't? You don't hear Stalin deniers because, we won. That's why. I mean, we were talking about this too in class. If you win, you get to write history, right? But the reality is this, that Stalin was just as big a murderer as well. But he was on the winning side. So this is something that you don't see him, in the same vein as well. He killed millions. Check it out if you don't know about that. And yet you don't hear people denying that. So, and it's all recorded as well. Anyway, conspiracies. So we're putting together a greatest hits conspiracies here. We'll be adding to this, no doubt, in these last days as we keep going on. And, just all I'm saying is, as we just saw the verse, examine everything carefully. Because, we can say, oh, that's crazy. How could you deny this or think this? Well, Satan has something for everyone, okay? And so he has something for you too if you're not careful. And if you are careless, then you might fall into something. Maybe not as obvious as this, but guaranteed he is a genius and he can deceive individuals quite easily if we're not careful. So hence the exhortations, examine everything carefully, be on the lookout, beware, all these things. So look around, you'll see the proliferation of conspiracies as well. Again, are there conspiracies? Yes. Yeah, well, of course. But, when we look at these are unsubstantiated. And actually, as I mentioned, many believers are off course. There's conspiracies that actually distort and impede spiritual progress. And some of these, with some believers, they left the straight and narrow over stupidity. So, all right, to our study here in Esther. So we've done a couple of doctrines here, but we were just in chapter 7, and this is where the second banquet takes place, of course, and Esther reveals everything here and points the finger at Haman and accuses him. And of course, we see how everything is just so where he could not get out of his own way, including tripping onto the queen. at this party, and you can imagine, and if there was any inopportune time to trip and sprawl anywhere, that was it, right on the queen. Right when the king is walking back, remember, the king was very angry, he was incensed, he was enraged, walked out to the garden, came back just as Haman was tripping onto the queen, and that he was already a dead man, Haman, but that was just it, as we would say, the final nail in the coffin, although you could say the stake for the impalement. That was disgusting. If you remember the graphics that we saw, that's how he died. He was impaled. So he's put to death, as we see here in verse 10, chapter 7. So they hanged Haman on the gallows. This is, again, they impaled him on a spike. Think of that. That is not hanging on the gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. So 8, verses 1 through 2. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had disclosed what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. The analysis of verses 1 through 2 here. 1, despite all this conniving, Haman's plans were a complete failure. 2, here he's again appropriately described as the enemy of the Jews, if we see back in chapter 3, verse 10 here. Of course, he's introduced as the main antagonist, the villain of this whole thing. Super evil. So he, this is when Haman got his plot rolling to kill all the Jews, and he sought the king's approval, which the king, of course, did callously. But 10, then the king took a signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. So you see the signet ring here, right? It goes over to Haman. And that is essentially a sign of his authority, that Haman can do whatever, and this is in the name of the king. So no one could question him about what was happening or anything like that. So the enemy of the Jews. Now 3, as an enemy of Queen Esther, he became the enemy of the king. He never saw this coming. And you can see, again, we know what's happening. We see the details, but from Haman's perspective, yeah, things weren't going as smooth, Remember, he had to honor his enemy by parading him around on a horse. And so that was a bad day, and really bad. But as we noted, he has no idea what bad is, because it was going to get terrible. This is going to be the worst day of his life, and actually the last day of his life as well. But here, 4, consequently, Haman lost his life and his property. 5, the historian Herodotus attests to Herodotus, just so you know, he is considered the father, so to speak, of Western history. Okay, he was a Greek guy, and he recorded all kinds of, he wrote about the Persian Empire and the Greek histories and so forth. And his accounts are, sometimes they're not all, it's not like it's scripture, okay, but there's some sensationalistic claims in there and so forth. But generally speaking, it's a good, it gives you a good idea of what went on. And of course, he's recording things that he lived during that time. And so he has some records of this, where the historian Herodotus attests to this practice among the Persians. The property of a certain trader, Orotes, was forfeited to the state. So the king, basically this guy betrayed the king, this Orotes, and then so he was summarily executed, and then all his property was taken. So kind of an interesting story, though. If you ever notice, if there's a little number you see by the sentence or whatever, that's a footnote. If you look down to the bottom of the page, it'll tell you where that information came from. if you ever wanted to, you can actually go into this, into Herodotus and Histories. It's public, it was written a long time ago. It's prior to copyright, like 400 BC. So there's no copyright laws with that, but you can go into the histories and you can read actually what happened. It's an English translation, but it's kind of interesting here. And I think the traitor here, Orotes, was he was executed, but he was a strong guy. He was a very powerful prince, and he had people guarding him and so forth. And the story goes that the king had to plot to put him to death and so forth. So it's kind of if you want to go in there, I'm not going to describe it all, but it was kind of an ingenious way to entrap him and so forth and put him to death. But the end result, he was executed and he forfeited his property. Now, here 6, Josephus reports that the Persian king Cyrus issued a warning to those who refused to help the Jews in resettling the land. And so here Cyrus says, but my will is that those who disobey these injunctions, the injunctions meaning this, the command was given to help the Jews. Do whatever is necessary, help them resettle the land. So if you felt like, no, I'm not doing that, then this applied to you. Said, but my will is that those who disobey these injunctions and make them void shall be hung upon a cross and their substance brought into the king's treasury. And again, this idea of hanging on a cross, this is impalement. And not only that, you would die knowing that all your property and everything would be forfeit to the king. So this was at least a recorded practice. Here 7, it was the prerogative of King Ahasuerus to dispose of Haman's estate in any way that he chose. 8, on the very day of Haman's execution, the king gave the house of Haman to Esther. So again, if we're looking at the time frame and the occurrences, we understand that the banquet 1, banquet 2, it was within 24 hours. That night, or whatever time of day it was for a banquet, Haman was executed right then. It didn't, like put him in a cell, we got to think about this. No, he was immediately executed and impaled on that stake that he had intended to put Mordecai on. At that point, though, after that was done, then again, as our verse points out, on that day, so all these things are happening very quickly. And so the house of Haman was issued directly to Esther that day. She assumed control over his estate. 9, also on that day, Mordecai comes before the king for the first time in our narrative. What's interesting, too, in a way, is, if I might go back to this, is that Esther, she's queen. I mean, does she need this? No, but it's kind of an odd, in a sense, an odd gift. Here you can have the estate, but it's done, because now the king, for the first time, knows that Esther's a Jew, and so this is seen like, well, okay, your enemy here's his possessions. And so maybe, some interpreters have looked at this. Maybe the king was feeling guilty that he signed off on this, or who knows what's going through his head. I mean, he's an egomaniac, okay, and evil. And so you don't know if he's trying to compensate for his lack of compassion and his evil for his beloved queen. But anyway, she gets all the estate and the property. So here 9, also on that day, Mordecai comes before the king for the first time in our narrative. 10, Esther had finally revealed to the king her relationship to Mordecai. This is another thing that has given interpreters issues. They think, and they look at this and say, this can't be true. This is somehow inaccurate because there's no way that the king didn't know about the relationship. And actually, though, when you look at the correspondence, when you think about the correspondence that Esther has had with Mordecai, it's been through a very trusted eunuch, someone they could trust, that would not be revealing anything. That is why they used this particular eunuch and had trusted people, because they wanted this to remain a secret. And so it was. And besides that, as when you look at King Ahasuerus and his character, he wasn't a really curious guy anyway. I mean, he just signed away the lives of millions of Jews, or at least thousands, without even asking who they were. You know, sure, I'll sign off on this. So the idea that that he didn't know, well, that's believable. That's very believable, as a matter of fact. And on top of that, Esther took great care, so did Mordecai, they took great care in concealing this. I mean, again, that was Mordecai's order. Don't let anyone know, about this at first. And then it became to the point where after the edict, it's like, well, now you need to know. Who knows, that you are in this very position so that you can do the greatest good for the Jewish people. But of course, to do that, you have to reveal yourself as a Jew. "11. The king honored Mordecai by giving him the royal signet ring. 12. It had been repossessed from Haman. We just saw that. The king had given it to Haman when the decree went out. He had taken it back, obviously. 13. The king's signet ring indicates that Mordecai had been promoted to the second in command in the Persian Empire. So quite a promotion. So within 24 hours, Mordecai, remember where he's been. He wasn't at the banquet. He was out at the king's gate and sackcloth and ashes. He had a brief respite when he was paraded around, on a horse and robes and so forth. But other than that, his station, he was mourning outside the king's gate. He goes from that to now, imagine, within 24 hours, second in command in the Persian Empire. That is quite a promotion. And what a change of circumstances that you have. And that is the thing here that you see when God acts, and of course that is the main theme here, when you see God's providence, his blessing, his grace, his protection of the Jews and so forth, you see that when he does